You're listening to Food for Thought, the OFM podcast, brought to you by Vespa, nature's catalyst for optimizing fat metabolism.
Hi, welcome to Food for Thought, the OFM podcast. And I'm your host, Peter Defty, along with my co-host today, Dr. Jonathan Edwards. And today we have the distinguished Alessandro Ferretti on board. Yes, good man, as you say. You are distinguished in our view. And this is truly like another one of those international podcasts that we do. Jonathan, you're calling us from France, in the south of France, is it?
I'm in the south. Yeah, hello everybody. Yes, now I'm in the south of France. Alessandro's in Great Britain there, and yeah, it's very truly international.
Yep, this is the wonderful world of globalization, where the internet is making the world a much smaller place. So, this is we've known Alessandro via the internet and Facebook for several months now, and actually got together for a lot of great conversation at Low Carb USA. Thanks, Doug, for hosting that. But one of the interesting things that came out of our conversations with Dr. Edwards and Alessandro are a lot of very similar findings and commonalities that we've all come to independently with the OFM program, and we wanted to talk about that. And plus, Alessandro, later in the podcast, we're going to be getting into your work with heart rate and heart rate variability specifically. But let's get you going, because this podcast is really about you. So take it away, Alessandro. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what your background is, how you came to do what you're doing, and as we have questions and comments, we'll interject, but hopefully we won't all step on each other.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's always a great opportunity for me to share my little work. I am a nutritionist and train as a classical nutritionist in a scientifically based college, and then kind of the reality was a bit different out there. So I started to research more and more, and starting to obviously have slightly different findings from the one that we were taught at school, and that prompted me to research further. So I'm not sure now if I call myself as a nutritionist or a researcher, but that's pretty much how I would sum it up in general. And
I'm gonna stop you right here, because I look at you as one of those people who's out there actually innovating in moving nutrition forward in a very positive way. So I'm going to crown you as an innovator in nutrition.
Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate that. But the area of interest that started from personal reasons and then expanded to public are mainly metabolism and heart rate variability. These were my two main ones, but they would encompass some nutrigenomics applications and everything that extends beyond that. And the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is because I ended up in my view at the time, on a very healthy lifestyle and nutrition. So organic food and, kind of carbohydrates were healthy, hardly any sugar in the diet, training 3, 4, 5 times a week. I ended up virtually pre-diabetic. So my glucose was always fasting in the 5.6, 5.7 millimolar, which equates to, the 105, 115. And I thought that this is not looking good, given that familial history shows that I had, a predisposition for Alzheimer's, dementia, type 2 diabetes. And I thought, well, only 42 and I'm already at that stage, is not looking good. So that's the reason why I came across the more low carbohydrate, high fat approach, when is useful, who is suitable for, who's not suitable for, and then my further interest in heart rate variability. So this is how I end up doing what I'm doing.
Now, did you originally were not a science nutritionist based thing? You're from Italy, and you used to work in a completely different field. Is that correct?
That's correct. I used to be a motorbike racing engineer, so the kind of curiosity on how things work that's still there. I just swap media.
So you were a racing engineer?
Yeah, motorbike racing engineer.
Oh, really? For whom? This is getting even better because both Jonathan and I have keen motorbike backgrounds.
Well, we started our own team called, well, translated from Italian will be Out of Revs, Fuori Giri. And then I basically, I did not had at the time what actually would take to win. So I decided, well, the closest thing to that is actually focusing on actually repairing them, make them go faster and develop them. And so we got.
So what kind of bikes? What kind of bikes were you racing?
We started at the time. We still had 2 strokes, so it was a little bit of time ago. So we did the 125 GP with a Honda. We did the 250 with a Suzuki at the time, and then we entered with the original 5851 Ducati, and at the time was the Superbike.
Okay.
So this is all road racing.
You were doing GP road stuff. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Wow. Only on track.
Oh wow. Well, I in a past life I had a Norton Commando and I had a Ducati 900 SS, a 78, which was the year Mike Halewood won the Isle of Man on an NCR Duck. So that predates the 851.
Wow. Small world, very small world. I think.
Yeah, and Jonathan, of course, has a huge background in motorcycling.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, I'm not in the road racing, the motocross industry. Yeah, I raced. I was going professional up to age 19, sponsored by Yamaha and the whole bit. And long story short, busted myself up well enough that going to medical school was a better decision.
Well, and he was also the team doctor for the Red Bull USA.
Yeah, the Dakar Rally. I've been the Dakar Rally team, USA Red Bull KTM for 5 years. I did that race and when it was in Africa.
Wow.
So I knew somebody at Mioni, Fabrizio Mioni. You may have heard of him.
Fabrizio Mioni, yeah.
Yeah, I had I massaged him, and then he died the next day. It was quite a shock for us. Yeah.
Wow! This very small world, Alessandro. Because I never knew we all had that. I knew Jonathan and I had this all in common, but I never knew you also had that in common. Because I actually went to Europe when I was 20 years old or something to watch people like Kenny Roberts and Randy Mamola and all those guys ride the GP circuit there in the match races in Italy and at Imola. In Italy and yeah. Wow. So this is a great background. So let's just kind of move the conversation along. So we all have these competition backgrounds, somewhat testosterone filled, but let's move it on down. That we kind of had some things in life that got us more into how we could help people become healthier and perform better at the same time. So your background took you from there and to England and all this. So continue on.
Yeah, absolutely. This is in a nutshell how I got to starting to study the potential applications in not only in myself but then extending it to other people, and then because of I think my passion for sport, then I came across a few athletes, and they asked me to do some work with them, and then through the lecturing, meeting guys like you, then it took a lot more kind of direction towards the sports performance. And one of the things that, especially recently, I'm mining a lot of data. Where I'm taking variables like glucose and ketones, if applicable, both breath and blood, ongoing glucose measuring, heart rate variability, And I'm starting now to look at cortisol, cortisone, endogenous that is, and all sorts of other variables to try to identify patterns and critical points in which we can then advise people better. That's my utter interest. I'm never afraid to kill my ducklings, as we say here in the UK. I'm not sure if it's international, but meaning I'm not attached to a specific idea. I always try to evaluate what is the best possible solution given a specific scenario, and also given a specific metabolic predisposition or genetic predisposition. So this is where I'm currently at. Yeah, I'll do my best. I think I have the Italian disease on the 2 minute, then it can easily become 20, but heart rate...
Well, we can go down that rabbit hole, but let's start with the simplistic version.
Sure. So heart rate variability is a measurement that looks at the variations between the heartbeats. So if we assume that the beat someone has to get around figure 60 beats per minute, most of us assume that the heart will beat at every second, at the cadence of every second. In actual fact, it's not quite so. So the variation between heartbeats can actually be quite substantial. So, for example, the first beat is bang on a second, the second one is 0.9, the other one is 1.1 of a second. And as per the 30s, we started to, well, doctors and medical staff started to researchers started to realize that there were some association with certain diseases. And the first field, as far as I am aware, it was actually cardiovascular. So the people that were affected badly as far as cardiovascular system is concerned, had a very, very low variation between the heartbeat, meaning it was actually very, very like metronomic regular. Whereas eventually they started to realize also the association in, for example, depression, in other conditions, and eventually ended up in sport, looking at a well-rested system would have an increase, generally speaking, heart rate variability, whereas someone that will be inflamed or where the sympathetic activation is predominant, then it will be a much regular heartbeat. So we can take this in a nutshell as a parameter for sympathetic activation and inflammatory response.
Yeah, if I may interject, I know some of the origins of heart rate variability has its roots made in the chaos theory, and I know they were showing through equations using mathematical chaos theory that people who had less heart rate variability just had simply higher mortality.
Correct. That's correct. That's exactly the very first original. I mean, now we can get heart rate variability from a smartphone camera for a snapshot type of reading. And if we compare this to the type of ECG machines that we had, in the 30s, and 1930s and 1950s, then you can easily realize that the application were really limited. Whereas nowadays, everyone virtually has access to some form of heart rate variability device or type of reading. So yeah, but originally it was exactly that.
Yeah, there's some apps now on the market, right? That you can just download to your smartphone. If you have the apparatus, you can instantly start tracking your heart rate variability.
Yeah. I mean, I classify heart rate. Okay, the heart rate variability has a time domain and a frequency domain. So generally speaking, there is one parameter called RMSSD, which is the root mean squared of the standard deviation of the beat, which most of the kind of applications and algorithm seems to be based on that. We also have other applications in relation to the frequency. So we have ultra low frequency, high frequency, and so on. And depending upon what the person is looking or trying to quantify or assess, then the choice of the variables is also very important. Because for certain things, for example, RMSSD, it's still a good parameter, but for other things, then maybe just a simple app that is 99 cents or pennies, it could be more than sufficient without having to go and mess around with strap or portable ECG sensors. So there is a great choice depending upon also the type of measurement. Is it an ongoing measurement? Then only certain devices will be applicable. Or is it a snapshot first thing in the morning, every morning, to try to give us an understanding of where our body is at? And also, what are the limitations between these two systems?
Yeah. Now, just for the audience, for reference, one of the things, like whatever devices you're using, whether it's heart rate variability, whether it's a simple app or a more sophisticated thing, you want to use that one thing for collecting your data, because, like, for example, percentages of body mass with fat, there's all these different things. So you don't want to hop around between devices if you're collecting data, because these are really kind of sort of references, because a DEXA is going to read very much differently than a caliper or a tank or a chamber. And so, is that correct?
Yeah. And if I may, this is a really, really good comment, and so many people get confused by it. That is absolutely spot on. And also, in the way how the measurement is taken is exceptionally important. So if someone takes a snapshot type of reading to understand where they're at, we generally suggest to take it first thing in the morning. It doesn't terribly matter, the position. I mean, there are variations in the position. So for athlete, for example, a standing position may be more advisable than a supine, but there are all sorts of different things to look at. However, the thing that I keep stressing on is making sure that as many variables are controlled. So if someone wakes up and they stand up, they have a glass of water and then pop to the loo and then come back, always maintain that routine. Not that one day they stand up, the other day they don't, the other day is an hour after they woke up, another day is just after seeing the emails. And so just really try to make sure that the measurement is taken without taking any environmental changes on a daily basis. So most of the time this is quite easy because first my procedure is exactly the one I mentioned. So I wake up, have a glass of water, pop to the loo, back, and take the reading. And that is, between 60 and 160 seconds. So it's actually very, very effective way. And also, the investment in time is exceptionally limited, is 2 minutes. So that adds a little bit more to the specificity of the application. I have tested across a couple of people taking the readings at different times of the day. So one day is in the morning, one day is, but there is so much noise within that data that I wasn't able to make any reference based on such a high variability of the measurements, how the measurement was actually taken.
Okay, so that we've got that context, consistency with equipment, patterns of doing things, so we can get, so the listener, if they're deciding to look at their heart rate variability, can get it. But also, let's dumb it down for me, not the audience. Let's dumb it down for me, and this is for both you, Alessandro, and for Dr. Edwards, because as an anesthesiologist and somebody who has a very deep understanding of cardiology, let me dumb it down to see if I'm sort of understanding what both of you are saying. You know, when you have a very narrow window of heart rate variability, that's probably indicating stress and not a good thing. Whereas a nice high variability is probably a good thing. So I want you guys to both take it like you, Alessandro, and what you're seeing with your work, and then Dr. Edwards to provide context in terms of a cardiology aspect.
Sure. So a very low variability is normally associated, depending upon, once again, what parameter someone is actually looking into. Generally speaking, a low variability is associated with an inflamed, stressed, sympathetically activated or sympathetically dominant, and if we want to be really petty, is the actually lack of parasympathetic activation, with people that can potentially either we look into chronic inflammation or acute inflammation, or, for example, cardiovascular diseases. If his application in a normal day or working day, that could be a stress response from the previous day. I've done a lot of research through traveling. For example, when I was lecturing in a different country, or I was lecturing in the UK, when I was just working in the office. So at the same time, tracking all sorts of other variables to combine with that and actually see what were potentially metabolic outcomes. Then we have more of an ongoing type of reading, and that can be useful to assess what exactly in the environment is affecting the baseline reading. So that is one thing. With an increase in variability, so when the number of the score that a specific app or system or algorithm will give you, generally speaking, is associated to a higher resilience and a better health status, up to a point. Because, for example, if there are certain conditions like atrial fibrillation and irregularities due to either, I don't know, we sometimes find this in ultra endurance elite athlete, or an exceptionally low heart rate, this is when, unfortunately, we may not be able to use HRV as clearly as a guidance as we would under normal circumstances. So obviously the gap between these two kind of status is very, very wide. In fact, looking at, for example, a few months of data, we are generally speaking able to understand if someone is a recreational athlete or is actually an endurance professional athlete. This is just by looking at the data. So it's very, very powerful tool if used correctly, but there are a few limitations that people need to be very aware of.
Yeah, I think we're in kind of some new ground with that, because I know that in the ultra endurance type of sports, it's very common to have the tachycardia and very low heart rate. I actually have that. My friend Bruce has that. Jonathan, do you have that going on?
So yeah, no, I have a very low heart rate. I mean, I wake up with like a heart rate of 38 to 40, and then I do my breathing exercises, and I've seen it go as low as 26. So that's probably not the ideal time to take my heart rate variability. So, but
yeah. Well, that's the problem. Is sometimes I've been asked, do you have a heart rate, because it gets so low. But the tachycardia is very commonly seen, and
endurance athletes. I was gonna say I actually work with electrophysiologists who are specialists in, say, placing pacemakers and internal defibrillators. So, and I see these sick heart rate pathologies such as Wolff-Parkinson's White, SVT, which is supraventricular tachycardia, and then there's variations of that, atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter, and the whole gamut. And it's interesting that even the pacemaker companies are actually inserting algorithms to mimic heart rate variability, because they know this fact, of the mortality associated with, a low heart rate variability. So, that was one thing I was going to comment on, and then this next thing I was going to comment on, and then Alessandro, should answer is, in so many high performance endurance athletes, they have low resting heart rates. So it's pretty hard in the morning to check those heart rates. So, we need some guidelines, just some advices. But the other thing is, to lead into atrial fibrillation and flutter, for the masters athletes, it's quite a common phenomena, and you have to ask yourself, is measuring heart rate variability just one of the many things that could give you a heads up if you're headed that direction as a masters athlete, and in the world of triathlon, this is big deal, because people are actually dying out there in the water, and or elsewhere. So I think it's an important question, and I think something hopefully you've touched on.
Yeah, absolutely, Jonathan. Yeah, reflects exactly my views, in the sense that the heart rate variability does not tell you if that day you can train or not. It's an addendum that mixed with your subjective reported data, glucose level, or whatever other variable the person is taking in consideration, is able to advise the person to take a more informative decision. This is really, really important, because so many people, today my HRV is down and I can train, but they actually feel really good. Well, in that case, maybe just go ahead, but perhaps rather than having a blasting hill session in cycling or a power session, maybe just work on something else. And I do this every single time. I try to put in as much context as I possibly can. So for an athlete, there is a master athlete or an ultra endurance elite athlete with very, very low heart rate, then even that has to be put into context, because we need to look at the data of the person. I would say I prefer to look over a period of 2 to 3 months. So we understand, we have already a good baseline, we have already an understanding what happened in a high intensity period, in a high volume period, combining the both. So we can compare that, for example, from normal period of training onto a modular training. So, and we see the reactions and how the coefficient of variation of the heartbeat actually responds. So in the event that the heart rate is very, very low, I tend to prefer to provoke an environmental challenge. So, for example, supine position of taking, as far as reading is concerned, I would definitely avoid that, because normally in jargon we call it the parasympathetic flood. So when some of these athletes actually relax, and exactly what happened to you, Jonathan, if I may say, it's, you lie down and then you start breathing exercises, my heart rate drops of about 10 beats as well. But if it goes below certain values, I tend to suggest to take the reading standing and after the person feels awake, if that makes sense. So we can have a little bit of we use a little bit of a postural stress, very, very gentle, in order to regularize the beat. This is a procedure I have personally found being a little bit... There is a lovely podcast from a researcher called Andrew Flatt, and most of my information come from Marco Altini, Jason Moore, Greg Elliott. They have a course on HRV called HRV course, incidentally enough. And there are lots of these little information if you want to deepen your basic knowledge on what is HRV, postural challenges on the reading, and a little bit more of the of the more complex data towards the end as well. So one of the things that we look, if I see a value of, for example, RMSSD that is very, very high, and the person is performing at a really high level, automatically I would change the reading position and, just adapting to that specific person.
So, yeah. So to kind of place this in, I want to move this sort of like into this realm so we can throw some balls in the air and muse over what's out there and what we're all sort of collectively developing is the other big variable, whether the athlete is a young one, but particularly like for the middle-aged athletes, is whether they're fat adapted versus carbohydrate fueled. And, this has huge implications for, the cardiovascular system, and what we're seeing, and since I'm the one that doesn't have to, I don't have the letters behind my name, what we're seeing is that cardio, the suggestion that cardio might be deleterious or not necessary kind of goes out the window when you're fat adapted. We're seeing that this moves the physiology in a better way, and I've sort of hypothesized that it improves the arterial distensibility for blood flow and all that. And I think that like breathing exercises when you're fat adapted would have thinking about that when you guys were talking about that, it has tremendous impact on the fact that you can do your breathing exercises, get the blood flowing, the arteries, opened up, and then all of a sudden back off, take your heart rate, and it's dropped just because of the, changes in your system. So let's kind of toss up some balls about this thing, about, what we're seeing with traditional carb fueled athletes versus fat adapted ones.
Sure. Is that, would you like to go, Jonathan? Or
no, I was just going to comment that you probably already showed that one right off the bat with your state of being pre-diabetic,
yeah.
before you started this journey.
Yeah, I got that one covered. Yes, I mean, okay, I am not attached to any specific idea, as I mentioned at the very start, and I just want to make sure to reinforce that, purely because being a nutritionist, I had an influx of people searching for low carbohydrate, high fat, because it's trendy, because they saw the friend losing kilos and kilos, and because of whatever. Now, doing some research, especially with my work with Dr. Benjamin Lynch, we have found that pathways are very, very different as far as functioning from glucose and functioning from fats. I mean, at the end of the day, it will still end up on acetyl coenzyme A. Yet, the level of efficiency from both mitochondria in the electron transport chain, but also in the production of free radical, seems to be greatly reduced when the body is using fats and ketones as a primary source of fuel. So to me, the biggest change was, and I want to make this exceptionally clear, like me, there are many, and amongst us, we were not to lash out on cakes. We were not to go mad with alcohol. We were the typical on a healthy diet and lifestyle. And I mean it. So my carbs would come from rice and sweet potatoes or normal potatoes. So it was a kind of slightly carbier version of a paleo style, whatever that may mean. And the complication I had combining the damaging effect of the exercise I did, which now I do more, but at the time the combination of the two did not work for my metabolism and my genetic predisposition and my current environment at the time.
In other words, the exercise actually exacerbated the dietary intake because you were just needing to take in that much more sugar to fuel your exercise.
That is correct. That is correct. And that led us to do some research in what were the potential advantages and why. I mean, to me, it didn't make any difference to eat carbs or not. I'm not, I wasn't part of any movement that wanted to prove one right and the other one wrong. That was beyond the point. But I definitely started to see that some of the changes and some of the recovery, for example, and all the other collateral benefits that this will actually bring about. And to me, constantly being involved in measuring glucose and ketones and looking at metabolic efficiency, there was a very net difference to the point that I took my HRV readings pre low carb, high fat, and then I had omitted the transition and then compare that to the data after I had been adapted, but the important point, after quite a few months, not a couple of weeks later, and there was a substantial difference within the baseline levels. Obviously, I've maintained the exercise routine the same, exactly the same period. As far as the intensity, I even counted the intensity of the training. So, and happens to be that my glucose in this period, comparing the two periods, had dropped of about 20 points in US terms and 1 whole millimolar and a bit in UK terms, or whatever is the measuring units. So it's quite substantial. That's quite substantial. Now, am I totally anti-carbs? Of course not. In some instances, I will actually use carbs and suggest to use carbs, but it has to be wise. It has to be kind of aimed and tailored in relation to the type of effort, in relation to the inflammatory response of someone, in relation to, is the person in acute phase, is a person in a chronic stage of inflammatory response, and the type of effort also, to me, is the main deciding factor. Measuring glucose prior training, I would like to have a little level of glucose in the blood accompanied, in my specific case, to some ketones. And if it's a really high intensity type of effort, I would probably advise to take glucose at the time. Or even cycling the two dietary approaches in order to really, really maximize the outcome.
So I can actually talk to on the being in medicine for sometimes. I totally agree with you, Alessandro. You take nothing for granted. I've seen every side of every disease, healthy, whatnot, and you get humbled sometimes. The whole idea of telling everybody they have to be, one diet or the other is just it's just baloney. And you really got to take each person is an individual, and everybody can be different. And if you can't, you appreciate that quickly working with people. The one thing I wanted to bring up was with giving the dietary advice and the as it relates to heart rate variability, as far as like congestive heart failure, for example, that's a great place, if you get people off just the refined carbs, and if you, even better, if you get them on a higher fat diet, they lose the salt, their hearts, their heart rate variability improves because the fluid load off of the heart, is better. And then you switch, then you throw in, of course, getting, better meditation, better, for lack of a better word, earthing or electrons in your body, and all of these kind of things in a medical sense make a difference in the patient. And I think, we're on the cusp of measuring that with heart rate variability. So, and then on the athlete side, definitely, if you could talk a little bit to how the heart prefers ketones, actually, and you've already alluded to, better tracings and heart rate variability measurements. with this, is that an evolutionary thing? Is it, what have you run across research-wise and in your own explanations? Research isn't everything, but you're obviously into this enough. You might have some kind of answer for that.
Hypothesis, many. Answer, I'm not sure. I never ever felt so ignorant in my life. I'm sure. I get humbled very, very quickly, very often these days. So we started to look at various complexes within the mitochondria, and we know the fat holds more ATP and etc. But I thought, well, these changes are substantial, so they're quantifiable, they're measurable, especially if someone does a low to medium intensity, high volume type of exercise. This is when the difference seems to be way more pronounced compared to a type of high intensity training. So I kind of merged brains with, strangely enough, an engineer that has an absolutely beautiful analytical mind. And what I really like about him, apart from the fact that I like him as a person, but that's the different story, but is the fact that he was not taught any biases. He was not taught anything. He was completely external to the world of saturated fat is good, saturated fat is bad, carb is good, carbs are bad. He was completely oblivious. And I thought, dude, this is the data. What do you make of it? And we started to do some digging, and he came out with an amazing model looking at cellular entropy and total cellular enthalpy. And we started to realize that the let's call it the efficiency of the mitochondria seems to dramatically improve when the substrate changes from sugar to fats involving also ketones. Okay, so there's slightly two different pathways, but for the sake of argument, let's keep it like that. So and to the point that we got to a kind of approximate calculation on what should actually be the caloric deficit, because even calories have started to go a little bit out of the window. And that's the reason why now I personally only work on food mass, not actually caloric value. Because if the body is functioning on glucose, there is a slightly higher level of reactive oxygen species made during the process of exchanging hydrogens back into ATPase and to form energy. So the mitochondria puts out energy, heat, and reactive oxygen species primarily. And depending upon what is the fuel, the proportion of these changes. And that is what really interested us, because we thought, okay, hang on a minute, how is this possible that someone in a faster state that can really run for 16 hours or something. There are some races that have been, we could not explain how on earth the person could actually get constant supply, and they didn't have the banana and the bars and the carbohydrates before, and were not fueling actually during the event. And I thought, this makes no sense given what I was actually taught. So when we started to do this kind of digging, we looked at some very, very powerful mechanisms that the body actually uses in switching complex 1 and complex 2 whenever that is actually more prominent from one type of substrate compared to another. People that get complex 1 jammed because NAD and ADH ratios are wrong. So there are all sorts of things that I personally think that, especially for a high volume type of physical activity, the type of substrate that is preferentially used, I think if it's fat it will actually bring some great benefits. And I'm saying preferentially use. I'm not cutting out the carbs out of the equations, and I want to be very, very specific in this. So these findings for us were pretty huge, because looking in our model of calculation for the calories, people may be able to maintain at minus 20% the caloric value if they're fat adapted, meaning is a gray area on that one. You know, when do you become fat adapted? Well, in my simple minds, I consider that when the body preferentially uses fats for energy.
Yes, and that was something we both discussed, because when we met at Low Carb USA, that was sort of exactly my finding, was there was this 20 to 30% lower caloric intake value, and you know, you're dead on about this, and so, you know, this has some huge implications for performance, and so. What do you think about this? What's your thoughts looking down the pipeline?
Well, I first of all, I try to make a distinction. What type of effort is the person doing? So what is the time of availability of, for example, oxygen? So sometime the carbohydrates definitely will be the preferential fuel. But yet does not mean that we cannot train the body in operating fats at much higher levels, as we know from recent study on ketogenic application and sport performance. You know, Volek and Finney have done, on the fastest study was the precursor, was the godfather of all. So I'd say that the application have a huge potential, and a correct timing of the substrate, personally, I believe, as we've seen already from some athletes, can bring some amazing advantages. And even the cycling, in order to train the body, I have some athletes that they try to, rather than focusing on building volume, on building on training, which is the purpose of the training, they start to take, for example, exogenous ketones during a normal training session. And you think, well, you're trying to train the body to do more with less. That's the purpose of training. Or just try to do more with what you've got. Unless someone is after a personal best on that specific day, the best fat adaptation I've ever achieved is when I put myself through a period and sequence of efforts and completely fasted, including high intensity training. And that created some damage, of course, but then made a switch. And now...
Right. It creates the hormesis, so the body will get stronger.
Precisely so. That's the English version of what I was trying to say. And also in a couple of words rather than 1,000. So I would train a specific body to be able to do as much as it possibly can, relying on a fuel, and then when it's actually needed, then maybe introduce the carbohydrate, or if they have, for example, a heavily catabolic session, in that case, maybe the use of actually simple sugars can be ideal. So that to me is also something else to consider. So is the type of training, the timing of the training, at what stage they're at, is it training or is it performance? These are all things that would have to be integrated, and personally I believe that by tweaking these and optimizing that,
Yeah, and that's what we do with the OFM program. So, you know, what we're trying to do is, you know, the goal is to get people as fat adapted as they possibly can for their potential, their situation, because some people have underlying conditions that's going to limit that, and then for their sport, and then, you know, the strategic carbs as you're saying, with the timing, and it all depends on the individual, their sport, the context, the environmental conditions. So there's all these variables that people have to sort of intuitively learn. And, we can develop all the data in the world, but if you start to try to engineer your program, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. And this is one of the beautiful things about sort of the way the Italian coaches coach is people like you and others, it's that blending of science and technology with the art of accomplishing something.
Yeah, I would say that the integration of these tools, exactly that. I mean, these are tools. So there is no, it depends. You choose your tools in relation to the job. You don't choose the job in relation to the tools. So
yeah, and so also I think the other thing that people need to realize is exactly that, but also that, on that given day, that given task, whether it's racing or training, you're talking about a very dynamic environment. So those tools may change over time.
That is correct. That's correct. So as my training is shifting towards, for example, a more resistant training, more catabolic tissue catabolism type of training, I may well implement some carbs in a different way. If it's just a normal, for example, even in a competition that I am maxed out for 3 minutes and then resting for 5, 10, 15, totally unpredictably as well, then I would function better fasted. And then I extended that to other people. And we started to get now a good body of data that once the person goes through that fat adaptation, even when they introduce the carbs, the body is still functioning in a much better state than what they were before. So that to me is a great advantage in combining all of these tools in order to achieve the best possible result.
So I'm going to provide a few little things for the athletes out there. So, our goal of, we use the strategic carbs, and I don't know, I have this sort of like radical term I use that in OFM, we look at concentrated forms of carbohydrates as a legal PED. And so using them sparingly and wisely for performance actually can provide huge performance benefits with minimal to no downside. But what we try to do is get that athlete into the best fat adapted aerobic performance level so they can perform at a very high level aerobically, burning mostly fat. And we've kind of seen this very successfully. Everybody says, oh yeah, you guys are just doing endurance. And of course the FASTER study was based on ultra endurance athletes, but we're going to bring suck Jonathan into this and talk about pro cycling. And I've got a gal doing jiu-jitsu that I just interviewed, and talk about how we bring them into this high level of fat adaptation, get their metabolism warmed up so that the hormonal and enzymatic signaling is ramped up so that you can burn fat, produce ketones, produce glucose hepatically to meet that metabolic need, and then start to roll in the carbs to add that bang. So Jonathan, talk about how they do it with how we did it with Roman, and how they do it on the Pro Tour, because, it's kind of for us, we just kind of look the other way during a race.
Well, it's kind of like I can just, do, for example, the exercise I trained with a kind of an elite cyclist today, and, I put in a kind of a big day for me. It was about 4 hours and 45 minutes, and he put in 7 hours and 50 minutes. So, and he's doing this day after day. He's in his, his winter training. But the point of saying all that is all these guys in the professional cycling world do these very long endurance days, and they are by default fat adapted. I mean, they can optimize themselves like like Romain does in the off season, where he watches his carbs very closely. I imagine guys like Chris Froome do the same. Steve Cummings, he does the same. And there's and I could name some others. But so I think at that level, they're all fat adapted. But is there a step above you can take it? By watching the carbs increase, watching the quality of fats and nutrients that you take in, like organ meats, here in France we eat this boudin noir. It's great, it's just blood sausage, but there's no other source of iron and fat that that actually brings you into that adapted state while maintaining your iron levels, and then you eat nose to tail. It's just about eating natural, and that's why I love Europe as well. There's so much more in tune with with natural consumption of eating meats and porks and that kind of things, and then also to touch on you get a better mitochondrial biogenesis from a higher fat state, and that's pretty conclusive. I mean, it's not just a exercise phenomenon, it's also from the nutrition. And again, it's another place that can be optimized, in pro cycling at least, and I'm sure it happens, in the ultra endurance guys, and then the only difference with the pro cyclist, it's such a dynamic sport, unpredictable, there is no way to get through the sport without adding the carbs in, around race periods, around very, very, very high intensity preparation, for the Tour de France or the Giro d'Italia or, whatever, what have you. So those are some, there's some big similarities and some big differences, but I think at the base of it all, it's very, very important to remember that each of those athletes put in so much time on the bike or running that they are fat adapted to begin with.
Yeah, and I think that the context of that is like Faster showed that these ultra endurance athletes were burning the low carb cohort, which I can shamelessly say that I coach most of those guys. Anyway, that low carb cohort were burning 2.3 times the fat of the high carb fat burners, which, as you say, they were good fat burners by the conventional science. Okay, so in ultra endurance, it's 2.3 times, but say for pro cycling, if you can increase that by 1 time or 1.5 time or 50% or 80%, as you know, pro cycling is one in increments. We're talking about seconds and minutes, between the guy who wins the GC at the Tour de France versus the second place guy. It can get down to, less than a minute, correct?
Yeah, well, being able to use your fat at 75% VO2 versus 65% VO2 is all the difference right there.
That's right. So, as Faster showed, if these people, they're using a lot of carbs, they might be 40, 50, 60, maybe 100% more instead of 230% more, but that's going to provide that huge incremental thing. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but even though a guy like Romain Bardet is eating a lot of carbs when he's on tour, it's probably going to be less. So if he's saying consuming 15, 20, 30% less during a ride because he's fat adapted, that also is going to provide that performance advantage because you're not having resources diverted to trying to process and digest those carbs, and you're just operating, as Alessandro has indicated, on a much more efficient level on a cellular mitochondrial basis.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of Romain's motivations for contacting us, is when you wrote that, the paper on the Faster study, that went viral, was the fact that he said to me that if I can turn my body into burning fat at even 70% VO2 max, he said, I can win the Tour. And that's what he told me, and that's what sparked his interest so much in working with us. And and then on the question of carb intake and during races, and you have to understand, it's a hard deal. Everybody's kind of fed the same thing, and unless you have the budget for a private chef, the world of cycling isn't so advanced, say, as like soccer, is like a football, which is the correct term, or in America we call it soccer, and so it still has a ways to go. But anyway, these guys definitely use less carbs, and they have less GI
but they can
distress.
eat. They're going to eat less. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
less GI distress for sure.
yeah. So go ahead, Alessandro.
If I just may add to that, is that there are all sorts of the digestive issues and bypassing that, which is clearly a great problem. So one side is exactly what you guys just mentioned, which is the optimization of the actual fuel in feeding energy production system. The other side of the coin that to me was really kind of bluntly shocking when we started to do the research into that, it was actually the much lower levels of free radical production that there is during the utilizations of fat. So if you imagine someone that can reach and burn fat at higher percentages of VO2 max, then also the damage to the body on top of digestibility and etc., the two combined are very powerful.
Yeah, and that's what we say, and I've been trying to reframe this whole recovery discussion because there's a lot of talk about recovery, and there are a lot of products for recovery. And, what we observe with our OFM athletes, and particularly when they're using the Vespa product, and I'm not saying this just because I'm the Vespa guy, but because it's just what the people say to us after. Just had a 62-year-old guy attempt 100, and he said, "I'm just not sore 2 days after." But that it's not so much that you recover faster, it's that you haven't done the damage in the first place. And this speaks to what you just said about free radical production that you're seeing.
Correct. And I measured also heart rate recoveries immediately after exercise and effort. I measured all sorts of other variables. So, for example, the heart rate in relation to a response to a certain training the day before, what is going to be the HRV the following day. And, 0.2 of a point in HRV, it can be substantial. Maybe for the recreational athlete, maybe it's not a big deal because the next class is going to be at a fixed time. But for a recovering athlete in at elite level, that can be a substantial difference between being the top of the classification or mid or down to the bottom if finishing at all.
Super. Yeah. Now, another thing that I do want to touch on about the use of carbs, Alessandro and Jonathan, is when you get well fat adapted and once that switch, that period where you get your hormones and enzymes are now upregulated, so your liver can produce ketones and glucose to meet the metabolic need. It seems to us observationally that the carbs have a much bigger effect and much more powerful effect using less. And can you comment on that? And then I wanted to lead this into Jonathan's own personal experience about glucose production and the wonderful way the body in a fat adapted athlete actually can produce significant glucose.
Yeah, sure. Well, the quoting what the vast majority people would describe that process is when you are fat adapted after a good period of adaptation, the body is nice and stable, and then they started to timingly add the carbs. Their comment is they're like rocket fuel. They don't actually see the increase of performance in just measurable power output or whatever, but in actually how their energy level feels and how their brain feels, which is, there is so much going on. I was reading an article from one of my colleagues called Craig Pinkering, and there's so much going on in athletic performance and the impact of the psyche and the psychology in sometimes the difference between an elite athlete and a non or another elite athlete, but one that wins and one that doesn't, is not so much on the physiology that can be very similar, but also how they perceive psycho-emotionally the effort, so who can actually push it to that level. And if the areas of the brain that they function only on glucose are actually fed timingly in moments where there would be, generally speaking, a drop within neurotransmitters and food and substrates and etc., then that could really make a difference. So we are talking on the physiology, but also having an effect, not just in the physiology. So it can go much, much further. This is an area that we're just scratching the surface, so I really cannot make any specific comment because I personally haven't seen any research on the psycho-emotional effects of a low carbohydrate and timing of carbohydrates. Yet, given the data that we gather now from athletes and recreational athletes, and even from personal experience, it is substantial. It is substantial, and how someone feels can really make a difference in their performance effort at that moment in time.
Yeah. Jonathan, comment on some of your experience with your fat adaptation, because you went from, being a conventionally fueled Cat 1 cyclist to a keto one, and then you've come to the OFM and this whole gluconeogenesis in a fat adapted athlete. Because I remember that time you called me one night and just were shocked that your blood sugar from a fasted ride had just gotten to the level it had.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. One thing I would say, just direct to Alessandro's comment, and if I had to redo medical school, the 15 years of school that I went through, there's zero question in my mind that I would do it fat adapted. I would learn to fast, and I have no doubt in my mind it would go way better. Anyway, that's out of the way.
You'd be using some Vespa for your exams
Vespa
too.
would have been great. Yep, especially before tests. It's 7,000 tests. You have no idea. Anyway, so my experience, is I was a conventionally fueled athlete. Made it to the Cat 1 level in cycling. Doing all that, and it works. I did fine. I got through it, and then had a long story short, a head injury, and I decided to heal. I wanted to heal my brain with ketones instead of carbs, and you can go read the literature. It's pretty clear your brain heals better on ketones. So that being said, I just found that there's a period of adaptation. About for me it was 8 to 10 months really before I really felt like myself again. So it takes a long time. And a pro tour guy, it probably takes 3 months, but you got to be patient about it. So for me, it took close to a year. And once I realized that I had to be patient with it, it all just kind of came together. And then, and then to comment on the increased glucose spikes that I was seeing with acute exercise, during some of my very hard training moments, I would spike my sugars into the 150s, and just you think that's totally opposite because you're suppressing insulin. You're doing this, or is it the cortisol? Is it the fat being actually made into the sugar? And if you have any questions on that, just go have a read at Chris Masterjohn's blog site, where he explains very clearly how fat can lead to the genesis of sugar, and these are things you will not find in the biochemistry textbooks. So, anyway, and I'm not the only one, and Peter will comment
and
how many people he's seen
it. It's quite surprising. It's quite surprising just how much glucose the body hepatically will produce, and that was corroborated with the glycogen replenishment data from FASTER, where the low-carb athletes, after running a 3-hour treadmill test at 65% of VO2 max, taking in insignificant amounts of carbohydrates, were actually replenishing their glycogen at or above the rates of the high carb athletes who were being given exogenous carbohydrates. Yeah, well, we know it happens. So anyway, Alessandro, tell us about a little bit about the relationships of cortisol and HRV, sort of in a layman's terms, and then we'll sort of wrap this up and get people out there scratching their heads too.
Sure. It's one of these things that I have been researching recently, and so I like to experience things and then try to put people through, the same experience to see if the data is the same and so on. So I took a test called Dutch test, which is a dried urine test analysis using spectrometry. So a lot more stability within the metabolites that they're measuring, and I wanted I got 5 of them and tried to quantify the changes not only in HRV but also in blood sugar level, ketones, and so on. So cortisol to me is very, very important to have an idea where it is at, and reactions from the body and secretion, and especially the ratio between the cortisone and endogenous cortisone and cortisol. And when we look at specific acute phases, so the cortisol and cortisone, the body is ruled by rhythms, and any potential changes within these rhythms and any potential anomalies can actually hinder performance quite substantially. I'm pretty sure that we are all very familiar with loss of circadian rhythms and performance, and in relation to sleep, in relation to how the person feels when the person trains, but also the levels of these hormones. And for example, I did I did my normal test, which was baseline, and look at my values. Yeah, optimal values. Couple of things were slightly on the low side, some others slightly on the high side, but my normal diet, normal training, normal work. And then I did one on a really, at the end of a high intense period where we saw massive spikes in cortisol and cortisone, drop in testosterone, drop in melatonin, so really quantifiable. And this was not something that was exceptionally hard period of training. Then I did one with work, and also very, very different results. So generally speaking, cortisol in an acute phase will affect heart rate variability in an inverse correlation. So the higher is the cortisol, the higher is sympathetic activation. Generally speaking, not so much at the time in which cortisol is high, but when cortisol stops, then we also have irregularities within blood glucose regulations. On the other hand, when the cycle of cortisol is, let's say, optimal, then this is also reflected in heart rate variability. And I think it can provide a great insight, because obviously measuring cortisol, unless someone has a medical team that is just specifically there for them, then it could be a little hard to quantify. So at times, even just knowing the patterns, knowing the baseline, knowing the volume of the training, so knowing this simple recordable variable, we can make, let's say, quantified and aimed assumption of what can potentially be the best test, and if it would involve testing for cortisol. So the correlation is pretty good. And after all of this research, I also noticed that we can use specific data to look at critical point also to understand if perhaps the best fuel for that person at that moment in time would be glucose. So we can also make potential refinements to the diet starting from such a simple measurement like heart rate variability. So this is how I have implemented and researched and then extended to different people the implementation of HRV and cortisol.
Wow. Yeah, no. And I think that the take home there is, like we look at the individual in OFM and we look at their whole environment and take a very holistic approach because, as you say, people, when they're athletes, they tend to look at what they're doing in just their athletics and not look at what else is going on in their lives, their work stress, their relationship stress. Circadian rhythm is a no-brainer. Everybody knows that one affects them.
Well,
don't you think?
Yeah, just to give you some context, I basically refuse to see an athlete. Can't really disclose too much, but the main reason was because the lifestyle of this person was totally unsuitable for the type of mole and volume and intensity of the program that the person had to undergo for a specific race early next year. And I'm a nutritionist, researcher, but I'm not a counselor. I studied counseling and psychotherapy, but that what gave me an insight to understand that the psycho-emotional stress for that person at that moment in time, given which I have worked out through looking at the HRV data, because I said, I was looking at the data and this happens continuously. I said, look, in the way how your body reacts to the type of training, there is something else impacting your health. There is an external value, an external load, something that does not allow your body to react efficiently. And that I tend to use that for that is something called coefficient of variation. So if given a certain training, the person's heart rate variability jumps around a lot, then automatically we can perhaps investigate other things not necessarily related to the specific training period or the type of training that they're doing that can affect heart rate variability. Remember that HRV, it measures the sympathetic activation and inflammatory response, and it's really hard to distinguish between the both. I've made multiple attempts and miserably fail in that to the point that the self-reported data seems to be more precise than just looking. However, in both cases, we have a sympathetic activation or lack of parasympathetic activation and an inflammatory response. So sometimes just looking at the coefficient of variation, we can gain a great insight in relation to the training. So if someone says to me, I just radically change the training program, then we can account for an increase in coefficient of variation because the body is not quite prepared for that type of training, so it will generate more stress in order to adapt to it, or just has generated more stress for the actual event. However, if we know that the athlete is undergoing a regular training session, we also know how their body should actually respond. And if it responds substantially differently with the HRV daily on a day-to-day variation jumping around consistently and substantially, then we know that there may be other causes that, and generally speaking, we found that the cortisol is either exceptionally elevated or flat, and testosterone virtually in all cases is down. This will affect melatonin. This would affect, so there is a consequential cascade of things that we can gain by a more advanced analysis of heart rate variability.
Wow, this is superb. And so heart rate variability is just one more great tool we have, but it's part of that whole biological system. So we got to look at all the numbers and kind of, read the tea leaves, as it were. Yeah.
I mean, to me, my interest is specifically is a quick, non-intrusive insight that can lead the person for further investigation if is needed or if is warned. So I help and support, let's say, people from all over the world, where either due to time zones or practicality, we cannot meet in a clinic and say, you know, how are you doing, how's the training? So this is an insight that I have in someone else. I use a coach app of a specific app where I can access all of this data. I can look at normalized HRV, I can look at the coefficient of variation, I can look at the intensity of the training, and I can look at the self-subjective data. And it takes me 30 to 60 seconds to just look at glance. And, you know, if nothing is said, then everything looks normal. Fine. But if I then start to see premonition signs or premonition trends, then I will inform the athlete. I will be on it like a hawk, because this is the difference between perhaps picking up an injury. So, for example, so many athletes, they feel great, they want to push it through, they want to keep going, keep doing, HRV is down, they pick up an injury. And what's really interesting is if they have even a pre-existing weakest link, it doesn't necessarily have to appear in that specific condition, in that specific part of the body. Generally speaking, when someone is kind of going towards an under recovery or overtraining, HRV is down, but mentally they feel they could push through, generally speaking, something not nice happens. And in my case is picking up injury. In this person's case was constantly raised glucose level to a point that, you know, as a nutritionist, I was starting to question the diet and how truthful the actually diet report actually was. And so there are all sorts of things that we can use from heart rate variability, not to diagnose, but to give us a better insight, perhaps to do further investigation. So, for example, in this person, I said, look, we need to understand what happens with your inflammatory response. We need to understand better your hormones. If you are in exceptionally high cortisone or in exceptionally high cortisol, and we ended up in that specific case finding they were completely flat and hardly any testosterone. And I said to the person, feed carbs. You're not in a state that you should train and carry on that fat adaptation. Just go back to a normal diet, revisit your lifestyle, revisit your life load, and then we can carry on. Which is the reason why I ended up actually said, well, if you're not prepared to make these changes, I don't want to set up yourself for something a little bit more, you know, a little bit like a major injury or a complete exhaustion. I'm not sure if this.
Yeah, and people do dig themselves a hole trying to do really strict fat adaptation, and then train and race this way, and put quite a bit of stress on their adrenals. Like you said, their cortisol, and testosterone were like tanked. So I don't know where this is all going to lead, but it's quite interesting, isn't it?
Well, most of the times I try to assess the person's lifestyle and have as much insight as I possibly can. Obviously, there are budgets. Obviously, you know, yeah, it would be nice to spend £3,000-4,000 or dollars or whatever and have a complete panel, which elite athlete may be having access to. However, just by taking a simple measurement, people can perhaps focus more on certain things rather than others, or maybe try to find critical points rather than having to test 2 times a week. So that I think is the great advantage of perhaps using this as a proxy, as a kind of canary in the mine to understand a little bit better of what is the physiology of the body. And I have noticed that when people made the transition to go fully fat adapted and then starting to timing the carbs in, then they maintain that slightly better level of heart rate variability, meaning how the body actually responds to stress response, to training, to life load. So it seemingly increases their resilience.
Yeah, you're talking about the OFM program. Yeah. Okay. Well, Alessandro, this was just an incredible insight, and I look forward to continue to correspond and work with you, and hopefully all our collaboration will bring some great breakthroughs. Dr. Edwards, any commentary or any other questions you have for Alessandro?
No, I think it's a good, good time to wrap it up, and maybe we'll consider another podcast. I mean, I'm thinking of so many other disease states and HRV, hypothyroidism and whatnot. I mean, you could just keep
yeah, no,
going
I
forever.
know we could go on and on. It's leading to more rabbit holes. So, Alessandro, if you're open to that, we should be scheduling in another month or so another podcast with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be my pleasure. That's exactly what I'm mining the data right now. Looking at HRV cortisol correlations and blood glucose regulations and self-reported data. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, let's do that, because I actually am scheduling some other people on to discuss some other things, hormones, particularly with female athletes, but we're also going to do stuff with male athletes. And I think when we're talking about cortisol, cortisone, testosterone, we're as I say, OFM is a very holistic approach, and science tries to control the variables. So what our mission here is to try to take all those different pieces and bring them together into a way that helps the listener, the athlete, to understand, how to get themselves in that highly fat adapted metabolic state, so they can not only be super healthy but perform super well, but also be able to tolerate the carbohydrates and get the benefits from them.
Sure, absolutely. And the other thing that you may find, guys, interesting is my work with my colleague, as mentioned earlier, Waco Jaros, in relation to the caloric versus mass of food, and the adaptation that we need to take and the approach that we need to take if someone is fat adapted, because they can easily end up relatively hypercaloric if they follow the same guidelines and going from a body functioning on carbohydrates versus a body that is fat adapted.
That's right, and that's why the second tier of the OFM pyramid focuses on nutrition, not calories, because if you get the nutrition right, it's easy to be in what today's world would be considered hypocaloric, but it's actually isocaloric for a fat adapted
That's correct.
athlete. Yeah, so super. Let's call this a wrap. Jonathan, thanks very much again for taking some time out from your little reprieve in France.
Merci. À bientôt.
And we'll be back with more here. Thank you again, Alessandro, for your time.
Very welcome.
And thanks for our listeners for bearing with us. I hope that they all get a lot out of this. And as our goal with Food for Thought is, we're going to send you away thinking about a lot of things as we are. Thanks.
You were listening to Food for Thought, the OFM podcast, sponsored by Vespa.